on our walk up a mountain in the Cairngorms. So welcome everybody to Plants with Altitude. My name's Alistair and this is Kaylee. What I'll do is I'll introduce us properly in a minute once everybody's had a chance to join, and you'll know exactly who we are and what we're doing. So this talk is part of Plantlife's Fall into Nature programme, which is a series of events which is happening all the way through October. Plantlife is a nature conservation charity that takes action for wild plants. And through this program, through the Fall into Nature program that we're running this autumn, you can learn about huge amounts about the things that we're doing in our work. Everything from international plant conservation to the lichens of temperate rainforests, all the way through to grass identification. There's a whole load of really cool stuff going on this month. But we're not doing any of those things today. What we're going to do is to climb a mountain, or at least we're going to do some stravaiging in the mountains. So it's a good Scottish word just to kick things off, stravaiging. It's a word that kind of means wandering without any clear destination in mind, which is quite a nice way to experience the mountains, I think. What we'll be doing is we'll be looking for some of the rare plants that live on our highest peaks, and we'll be chatting about some of the threats that they're facing. But I really, really don't want this to be a doom and gloom talk. We definitely don't need that for a wet, drizzly Monday. What I actually hope to do over the next 45 minutes or so is to convince you that we're on the cusp of an amazing opportunity. We can turn things around for our mountain plants. And in doing so, we can make things better for everything and everyone who call the mountains home. After the talk, we'll have a chance for some questions and answers. So please do ask questions and pop your questions into the Q&A box, which you should see on your screen at the moment. If you've got a question about the talk that you want us to answer at the end, then do pop your question into that box. If you've got any technical issues with the webinar or how that's running, then use the chat box, which you should be able to see as well. And also just to let you know that we are recording this webinar. Okay, well, let's start. And let's start by immersing ourselves in the Cairngorms. It's nice to just set the scene. This is a place called Loch Morlich, which is in the heart of the Cairngorms. If you were to climb up that steep slope to the right of the loch, you'd reach the summit of Cairngorm, which is the mountain that lends its name to the whole mountain range. If you were to climb up that steep slope to the left, you would eventually find yourself at the summit of Ben Macdui, which is the second highest mountain in the UK. I took this photo at midsummer. And just after I took it, my friends and I stripped off and we jumped into the loch to go for a swim. I've got really, really vivid memories of floating in the water, looking up at those snow patches at the head of the loch. And I genuinely don't know how much longer people will be able to do that, how much longer people will be able to swim in a loch in the Cairngorms in the summer and look up at the snow. That long-lying summer snow is one of the reasons why these mountains are so important for wild plants, and that summer snow has a really, really uncertain future. We'll be talking about that in a bit more detail when we get up there. But first of all, where are the Cairngorms? I'm chatting on about the Cairngorms as if everybody knows where they are, but there's no reason why you should do. So let's take a step back and orientate ourselves a little bit. So here's a map of Scotland. You can see Aberdeen, Dundee over there to the east, Hebrides to the west, Orkney and Shetland up in the north there. So this is the location of the Cairngorms, but the northeast of Scotland. And that location is really important because the location dictates the climatic conditions that give rise to a lot of the rare plant communities that we'll hopefully be finding on our walk today. That location means that the mountains don't experience quite as much of the milder wetter oceanic air that comes in off the Atlantic. The Cairngorms in general, they have warmer summers, they have colder winters, and they have less rainfall than the West Coast. And that is quite important in terms of the plants that we find there. So I was hunting around trying to find a bit more of a detailed map of the Cairngorms, just to give you an idea of the extent. I couldn't really find any maps online that I liked. So what I did, is I often do when I've got a question about the Cairngorms, I turned to this book, which is a book by Desmond Nethersole Thompson and Adam Watson, who were two pioneers of natural history in the mid-20th century. They did a huge amount to increase our understanding of the ecology of these hills. We'll actually, hopefully, bump into a few legendary figures when we're out and about on our walk today, and these are certainly two of those. Anyway, I really liked their map. I don't think this book is still in print, actually, but if you can get hold of it, I really recommend you to. So I liked their map. I don't know what kind of device you're watching this on, so you might struggle to see this, but it gives an idea of the extent of the Cairngorms and the kind of the complexity of the geography. That red line that goes across the bottom left-hand corner and then up across the top left-hand corner is the A9. The red line that runs up through the middle of the map and then turns right is the A93. And here's some towns that you may have heard of. That is Aviemore up at the top there. Then we have Ballater. We've got Braemar here, Pitlochry, we've got Brechin, and we have Forfar. So Cayley is from Deeside, which is up around about kind of the line that runs between Braemar and Ballater all the way down to Aberdeen up there in the northeast, and I am from Forfar. So I mentioned Cayley and I said I would introduce us properly. So here we are. I'm afraid I couldn't find any pictures of us. I think these will do. That's us. That's a good representation, I think. And anyway, you'll see us better a little bit when I stop sharing my screen at the end for the questions and answers. So I'm Alistair. I'm the head of Plantlife Scotland. I kind of look after Plantlife's activities north of the border. And Cayley is our community scientist on our Rare Plants and Wild Connections project, which is running in the Cairngorms at the moment and has been really involved in a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about today. The project manager for that project isn't here today, but she's called Gwenda Dyack. So it's almost time to start our walk. We're going to be climbing a mountain in the Cairngorms, but we're not really going to be climbing we're not going to be climbing a real mountain. We're going to be climbing a composite, a mashup of all the best parts of lots of mountains all kind of thrown into one. Now, there are hundreds of places where you could start your walk in the Cairngorms, but the chances are that if you've never been to the Cairngorms before, you may well find yourself starting here near one of the national park's most popular spots. This is Loch Morlich, with its beach, with its pine forests, and then the mountains beyond. So we're looking up here towards the Northern Corries, a very famous feature in the Cairngorms. From left to right, we can see Corrie Cass, then we can see Corrie Antonica, and on the right, we can see Corrie an Lochan. Okay, I hope you've got your rucksacks packed. Now, if you've got room in your rucksacks, you will need these. Plantlife have produced a series of publications about the wild plants of the Cairngorms. On the left here, you can see a leaflet which we've produced to help you identify some of the plants that you might find on the high tops. And on the right here, this Cairngorms Wild Plants Keys. This is a resource that we produced for mountain guides, for walk leaders, which give you tips on how to interpret the landscapes, both the natural landscapes and the cultural landscapes that you might come across as you're walking through the Cairngorms National Park. Both of these publications can be downloaded from the Plantlife website. I really encourage you to have a look at them. Now you'll see on the leaflet, on the bottom of the leaflet, it says visit the Cairngorms important plant area. And the fact that the Cairngorms is an important plant area is why Plantlife is working here. So important plant areas are, as it kind of says on the tin, they're the most important places in the world for wild plant and fungal diversity. So it's worth just remembering that as we wander up the hill today. The cairngorms are internationally important for their wild plant populations. Okay, so let's wander down to the loch to have a closer look at the hills. We've got a black-headed gull kind of photobombing the picture there, but I think this view is really important. It's not important because it's ecologically in perfect condition, but it's important because it could be. One of the most important things to remember about mountain ecology is how the vegetation changes, or how the vegetation should change as altitude increases as we climb the mountain. Different species can be found at different altitudes because of the different environmental conditions that are found at different altitudes, and those species group together to form zones. And those zones are hugely important. You can see the forest zone here, although that kind of block of forestry that's quite close to the loch, that's been considerably modified by man, and it's actually a plantation, although it's on the site of ancient woodland. You can almost see the Arctic alpine zone, which lies beyond the cliffs right at the top of the picture. But some of the zones which should be in the middle between the forest and the Arctic alpine zone are missing. There's a chance they could come back. Okay, let's start. So we're walking through the forest zone. There's actually, it seems crazy, but there's very few places in Scotland where you actually start your mountain climb in a wild forest, but you can do that in parts of the cairngorms. And it's amazing. It's just the best way to start climbing up a mountain, climbing up between these old twisted pines through the juniper thickets. It's really, really exciting. You catch an occasional glimpse of the mountains beyond through the branches. And then we make it out of the forest into the next zone, or at least where the next zone should be. Because in a healthy ecosystem, the forest doesn't simply just stop and the open ground begin. There should be a whole other ecological zone after the upper limit of the forests. And you'd be forgiven for not even realizing that it's missing, simply because we don't have any reference points or any collective cultural memory of it. I'm going to quote from that book I showed you earlier, something which was written by a chap called Derek Ratcliffe, who's another legend actually, who it's nice to bump into in the hills, but he wrote the chapter on vegetation in that book, and he wrote this. He said, man's destruction of the zone of subalpine to alpine scrub, which once lay immediately above the forest, has been virtually complete. So that means that we've completely wiped out a whole habitat across pretty much the whole of Scotland. Above the forest zone, which is the zone where trees can grow tall and grow upright, we should find the mountain woodland or the montane scrub zone. So up here, conditions are too cold, they're too windy, they're too wet and exposed for trees to grow tall and straight. But this is the zone of twisted, gnarled, low-growing Scots pines and junipers. Now, it's still possible to find scattered pines and scattered junipers up here, although they're very sparse and they don't really constitute an ecological community apart from one very specific point within the cairngorms where the habitat does seem to have held on in a tiny, tiny place. But predominantly, you really don't find this at all. You just find these scattered trees or bushes, if anything. I found these pines and junipers growing at around about 2,800 feet on the northern slopes of Bray Riach in the northern cairngorms. They are there, but they're really just so sparse. They're not really an ecological community at all. It's much, much rarer to find the real specialist superstars of the montane scrub zone. So the mountain willows, the willows are really the species that define this habitat. It's really, really hard to find them nowadays. They've been forced to retreat to inaccessible ledges on crags high in the mountains, and they're scattered and they're fragmented. We'll explore why in a minute. It's not just the willows and the other woody species, which should be a vibrant part of our mountain woodlands. It's wildflowers as well. Now here's globeflower. Again, it's largely found these days on steep cliffs instead of bringing colour across the mountain woodland zone. There's also water avens in this picture. There's a species of lady's mantle, and I think just right down the bottom left there, just creeping in, there's a little bit of roseroot. I was kind of hanging over the edge of a cliff as I was taking this particular picture, because these species, like the species we saw previously, they've been forced into living in these steep, high, inaccessible places. And this is an amazing plant. This is called Alpine blue sow thistle. It's a gorgeous species, quite a big species. It's actually quite common across much of Northern Europe, where it seems to like growing in mountain birch woodlands, kind of carpeting the floor in mountain birch woodlands at altitude. But in Scotland, we've only got 4 populations left. All of them are clinging to high, steep cliffs, isolated from each other and struggling to survive. Now, there's some really good work happening at the moment in the northern and the central Cairngorms to try to restore our mountain woodlands, predominantly through the Cairngorms Connect project and also through the work that the National Trust for Scotland are doing at Mar Lodge. It's really inspiring to see. It's fantastic. And it means that we've got a fighting chance of actually seeing these mountain woodlands return to landscapes like this. But in reality, large parts of the Cairngorms, and in fact, most of the mountains of Scotland, don't look like this. They look like this. Now, this is the glen in the southern Cairngorms. As you can see here, we don't have the forest zone. We certainly don't have a mountain woodland zone. There's no trees in this glen at all. Actually, I think there's a couple of large trees down at the bottom of the glen just hanging on, but that's it. There's some really, really interesting, really, really rare plants here, but most of them are confined to the cliffs that you can see just in the foreground there, or the cliffs away over on the far side of the glen. So what's happening? Why have these plants been forced to live in these steep, inaccessible places where we know from other parts of the world that they're quite happy living across these landscapes? What's going on? Simply put, we don't have these habitats and these species because of the numbers of herbivores, the grazing animals, which chomp the seedlings down before they get a chance to grow. And the number one grazing animal, which impacts on habitats in the Cairngorms, is the red deer. Now, these are ones which were grazing in the glen which we saw in the previous photo, and I just sort of zoomed in a bit to take this photo. I've counted about 170 deer in this photo alone. So the only place that the plants can grow, which are out of the reach of hungry mouths, is on the ledges and the steep, inaccessible rocks where the deer can't go. The deer are amazing. They're beautiful. They're a natural and important part of these ecosystems. Yeah, I loved seeing these deer kind of cooling themselves off on this snow patch in the summer in the Cairngorms a few years ago. But there's no doubt about it, their numbers have increased dramatically. In 1959, the population of red deer in Scotland was estimated at around 155,000. Today, the population is estimated at around 400,000. Their only predator since the wolf became extinct in around about the 1700s is man. Deer are highly valued. They're valued economically because sporting upland estates rely on deer stalking for a large part of their income, which means there are economic incentives to keep the deer population high. And they're also hugely valued culturally. And what this means that it's very, very difficult to get a consensus on appropriate deer numbers across Scotland. Very often, both sides in that particular argument, it's almost like the conservationists on one side and the deer managers, the traditional sporting estate managers on the other, seem to be speaking different languages. There's a huge amount to be said, I think, for listening and establishing that common ground where we can agree on shared values. And I've certainly learned a huge amount about deer, about stalking, and about how estates are run simply by talking to stalkers, chatting to estate managers, and even actually accompanying stalkers out on a red deer stalk on the hill, which was an incredible experience and something I'll remember for the rest of my life. It's amazing, actually, when you do start speaking to people, how much we've got in common, but we've still got a long way to go. So that's one of the threats that our mountain plant communities are facing. We lose the sensitive rare species that are sensitive to grazing. The species that survive under these conditions tend to be generalists, which can tolerate grazing, and they're quite often grassy species, kind of quite tough grassy species. The distinctiveness of the vegetation zones, which, as we've seen, should change as we climb up the mountain, is lost. The mountains become uniform and they become grassy. You can see that in the Lake District, actually, if you wander around the hills in the Lake District, and you can increasingly see it in the hills of Galloway as well. And that's quite interesting. Let's hang on to that thought, because we're going to be coming back to that concept in a little bit. Let's keep wandering up the hill. This is one of my favorite flowers to find on the mountain. It's called Scottish asphodel. It's a tiny plant. It's only a few centimeters tall. I always think it has a wonderful, otherworldly, fairy-like appearance. It's quite tricky to spot, but once you do spot one, then your eye almost gets in and you can start spotting more and more. And you can sometimes find you're surrounded by a whole patch of them. It likes damp conditions, so look out for it next to streams and flushes on the mountainside. If you look very carefully, you might find this species, which is moonwort. It isn't a flowering plant. This is actually a fern. Now that means that evolutionarily, it's a lot older than flowering plants. Ferns don't have flowers or produce seeds. They have spores instead. Now, moonwort isn't completely restricted to the mountains, and you might find it in some lowland grasslands and even sand dunes as well. It likes low nutrient environments, probably because it's not a very strong competitor. This means that if soil fertility is high, it gets out-competed by other species. It also can't tolerate overshading, which means it doesn't get on very well in scrubby wooded conditions. And that's interesting, given what we've just been talking about. I think it's a hint as to how complex and dynamic these systems are. So the more I look at that photo, the more I wonder if that is Lunaria or if it is Nordicum, which is another species of moonwort. But I would need to check that out, actually. It's just a relatively newly described in this country. So that's quite interesting, just looking at that there in the shape of the leaf, but I need to look at that. Anyway, that's moonwort. It is a moonwort. This is Alpine Bistart. Now, those bulbils that you can see on Alpine Bistart, they kind of pop off and grow into new plants, and that's one of the ways it uses to reproduce those little red bulbils. And again, you might find that around about or near where we find the Scottish asphodel a little bit later. Those bulbils, those red bits, are really important as a food source for ptarmigan, which is a very specialist mountain bird that spends its life near the summits of the highest mountains. You never know what you might see when you're out and about on the hill. This is an old shieling or a mountain bothy. It's nice to to come across this. People used to live in the mountains in the summer. They would take their cattle up to the high mountain pastures and they would graze them up here throughout the summer months, living in these bothies, these little stone buildings. It was a system of agriculture called transhumance, where people would move with their livestock up into the high altitude pastures and then back down into the glens, into the valleys in the winter. The remote, empty nature of the Cairngorms is actually quite a modern thing. These glens would have been, they'd have been lively places in the past. There would have been a lot going on. There's a whole host of complex reasons as to why people left, why that system of agriculture changed. But certainly even within the Cairngorms, the Highland clearances played a significant part, with people forced off the land to make way for big estates of sheep and deer. Once the people and their cattle left, the sheilings fell silent. They fell into disrepair. The sheep and deer numbers increased, and the modern pattern of land use that we see today was born. I sometimes think that we almost kind of forgot about the mountains at that point. That was where we started to turn our back on the mountains, and that disconnection has just grown stronger and stronger. What of you though? Ferns, like the moonwort we saw earlier, don't care whether they're colourful or not because they don't need to attract pollinators. But flowering plants definitely care. And a lot of them put a huge amount of energy into trying to look attractive. Now here we have got wild thyme, and we've also got Alpine lady's mantle, which is a bit harder to see in this photo. The wild thyme is the purple plant. The Alpine lady's mantle is the plant with the flat leaves opened out like the palm of your hand. I always think it's interesting to think about why plants are where they are. I think most plants would like to be everywhere if they could be, but they can't be because of a whole host of different conditions. It's not just grazing levels and tolerance of grazing that determine where we find plants on the hill, and nor is it just altitude. There's a whole host of things going on that determine the distribution of plants. There's things like exposure to the wind, there's aspect, whether the slope is facing north, south, east or west, and really importantly there is soil type. Different types of rock beneath the surface create different chemistry with different levels of nutrients that plants need to grow. So some of these plants, like the Alpine lady's mantle that we see here, are quite comfortable growing on a wide range of soil types, but some, like the wild thyme, only grow on calcareous soils, which are soils that are rich in lime. In fact, lime-rich soils are some of the best for plant diversity. A lot of the cairngorms are formed of granite, which creates acidic soils, which are low in minerals and therefore have lower plant diversity. They're still interesting, but slightly less interesting than some of the lime-rich soils. Occasionally in the cairngorms, you find limestone outcrops or underlying limestone, which gives rise to soils packed full of specialist plants. This is a frog orchid. I always love finding frog orchids, although they can sometimes be a bit tricky to find. They kind of blend into their surroundings. This is a species which is really struggling in the lowlands and certainly becoming endangered across large parts of Europe. It seems to be doing a bit better in the uplands, although it might be threatened by pollution. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so we haven't looked at any grasses yet. Let's have a look at this one. This is a nice, very charismatic grass to have a look at. Now we're in a calcareous patch of grassland anyway, so this is a good one for being in a calcareous patch. This is a species called Quaking Grass. Now, it's not hugely rare. You might find it in the lowlands as well. It's a really good indicator of calcareous grassland, and it's really pretty as well. It really does quake in the wind. It's beautiful to watch it quaking and blowing in the wind. I found this one in a place called Corrie Fee, which is a national nature reserve in Glen Clova in Angus in the southern Cairngorms. Don't forget to look up. We can spend lots and lots of time looking down at the ground, but it's always worth looking up as well. This is a golden eagle, which I saw in Corrie Fee as I was wandering about. It's just amazing what you can see when you're out and about in the Cairngorms. Actually, now that we're in the Angus part of the Cairngorms, it's worth just reminding ourselves that there's a good chance of bumping into some more of those legends, those giants of conservation and botany whose footsteps we walk in when we wander these hills. Now, Forfar, although it is where I'm from, it's got much more going for it than just that dubious honour. Forfar was, in the 1700s and the 1800s, home to some of the most amazing pioneering botanists. It's fantastic, actually, that Forfar now has created this garden to memorialize and commemorate those amazing pioneering botanists. Probably the most well-known of those was a chap called George Donne, who went on crazy hair-raising expeditions up into the Cairngorms to discover new plants. He discovered species that were new to science, and he really put Glen Clova in the southern Cairngorms on the map for rare plants. He was also a conservationist. He was way ahead of his time. In 1813, he was writing about the threat of extinction as he saw land management practices change around him. Now, hardly anybody was talking about the extinction of species back then, but he was noticing things even back then in the 1800s, and he was writing about that and getting concerned about that then. Two of George Donne's sons became botanists, traveling all over the world, making a whole host of important discoveries. And one of his great nephews is Monty Donne, the TV gardener. So there's obviously something running in the family there around plants and also conservation. Monty Donne is carrying on the conservationist family tradition, just making this tweet just even a couple of days ago, emphasizing the importance of going peat free. So there's something there, and a nice little link from the Cairngorms back in the 1700s all the way through to Monty Donne on Twitter today. But although it was rare to talk about extinction 200 years ago, it's all too common to talk about it now. You don't need me to tell you that the rate of extinction is increasing at a terrifying pace all over the world. We've already seen how increasing deer numbers are impacting on the mountain environment. In fact, George Donne would not have been able to believe how many deer we've ended up with in the mountains. Again, writing in that same book in 1813, he wrote that red deer are sometimes to be found on the Clova Mountains, but rare. How times have changed. But we really can't, we can't lay all the blame for species declines at the door of the deer. That's just one of a number of very complex factors. What else is causing these catastrophic declines? Okay, let's head a little bit further up the hill to try to find out. The plants that we find living up here are really specialist. They've adapted to a very harsh environment, a low nutrient environment with thin soils on ground which is battered by the wind, blasted by snow and ice, and where air temperatures are sub-zero for huge periods of time. The ecosystem up here on this part of the mountain is actually dependent on these extreme conditions. This white-looking moss is called woolly fringe moss. I said I wasn't going to use scientific names in this talk, but you'll find actually that particularly for most of the mosses, more people refer to them by their scientific names than by their English names. So not many people really call it woolly fringe moss. It's Racemytrium lanuginosum. So you'll mostly hear people refer to this moss as Racemytrium. These Racemitrium heaths are where one of our rarest mountain birds, a bird called the dotterel, nests. Without these mosses, these Racemitrium mosses, the dotterel would simply have no habitat, nowhere to nest at all. So it's hugely important in creating an environment that can be used by other rare species on the hill. So what happens to these places right at the top of the mountain when we do two things? What happens to these places when you crank up the temperature on the planet? And what happens when you take a load of potent fertilizer and dump it onto the top of the mountains? There's two questions. I'll come back to what happens when you turn up the temperature. But what did I mean about dumping a whole load of fertilizer on the mountains? What am I talking about there? Well, when we burn fossil fuels, we don't just release the CO2, we don't just release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We also release reactive nitrogen, largely in the form of nitrous oxides. This nitrogen, as you can see from this diagram here, it gets into the atmosphere. It can travel huge distances. It can travel thousands of miles sometimes before being deposited back to the earth in rainfall. And if you've ever been in the mountains, you'll know that they can certainly be rainy places. That means that mountains receive a disproportionately large share of nitrogen pollution. So this is nitrogen pollution coming from industry and from transport being delivered slap bang into the heart of one of our most sensitive ecosystems. So what does this nitrogen do? It does a few things, but one of the most important things it does from a mountain plant environment is it acts like a fertilizer. Essentially, it is a fertilizer. We're dumping huge amounts of fertilizer onto the tops of the mountains, which increases nutrient levels, allowing common plants, usually grasses, to move up the hill into these sensitive mountain ecosystems. And the grasses outcompete the specialist mountain plants. We lose the transition between habitats, which we should see as altitude increases, just in the same way that we do when grazing levels are too high. The mountains, again, they become uniformly grassy. What happens to the mountains when they become covered in all this grass? Well, you've probably worked out what happens already. Of course, the herbivore numbers increase. As the deer move into these newly created feeding areas, the deer think to themselves, hang on, there's a load of new grass growing up there that wasn't growing up there before. Let's go up there and munch on that. So they move into these areas. The deer, in turn, they reduce diversity, as we've seen, and simply by feeding there and by therefore dunging there, they again increase the nutrient levels. This creates a vicious positive feedback loop. And it's why nitrogen pollution is inextricably linked with grazing levels. And it's worth just stopping to think before we start going in too hard about grazing numbers. Yes, we need to get deer numbers down, but have we all been contributing to the rise in deer numbers in Scotland simply by driving cars and burning fossil fuels? The Racemitrium heaths, which we saw a few minutes ago, they're already on decline in the mountaintops, and this is largely driven by nitrogen pollution. When we lose the Racemitrium, we lose the other species like the dotterel that rely on it, and the whole mountains become impoverished, ecologically impoverished. Plantlife has been campaigning hard on the nitrogen issue for several years now, and it's something we're really continuing to do because it's such an important issue, and it tends to go under the radar. So that's what happens when we dump endless tons of artificial fertilizer on the mountains. But as we all know, we're also cranking up the heat across the globe. Now we've got COP26 coming up in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. There's never been more attention being paid to the climate. And one of the places that's going to get hit the hardest first is our fragile mountain summits. This is Moss Campion, which is one of the superstar plants of the Cairngorms Plateau, and it will be hit hard. Moss Campion is found throughout the Arctic, and it's also found in the Alps. It's a great example of a plant which has adapted to this harsh environment, and it really likes it up here on the Cairngorm Plateau because the landscape is very, very tundra-like here. So Moss Campion grows in these tightly formed cushions which hug the ground, staying hunkered down out of the worst of the wind and out of the worst of the cold. It actually likes being covered in snow, because what that does, this low cushion growth, allows it to be covered with snow very quickly, quite early in the winter. The snow acts as an insulating blanket, rather counterintuitively, but it's actually quite cozy under the snow. It protects the plant from the worst of the cold winter winds. Put very simply, less snow equals less Moss Campion. This is borne out by studies from this plant in the Arctic, which show that after a certain tipping point, populations collapse as temperatures increase. And this is Dwarf Willow, one of the shortest woody plants in the world. It barely reaches 2 inches high. It's a tiny, tiny tree. It's toughed it out in these mountains for thousands of years, surviving the cold temperatures by hugging the ground. And it's predicted to decline massively as the climate warms and as it loses its competitive advantage. Basically, if you've based your entire life plan around being tiny, because by being tiny, you can survive in an environment which other bigger, commoner plants can't, then it's devastating when that environment changes. Your competitors move in, and often pretty successfully, they wipe you out. It is worth remembering, though, that environments do change, and environments have changed. Climate has changed throughout history. Species adapt. Dwarf Willow has a few tricks up its sleeve. It's got 2 ways of reproducing, which is always a handy trick to have up your sleeve. It reproduces sexually, and it also reproduces through cloning itself. Now, cloning yourself is a great idea in the mountains, where up in the mountains, it can be hard to find a compatible mate, as several mountaineers will testify. But cloning does have its disadvantages as well. It means that you don't get any genetic diversity between generations, diversity which might give rise to a mutation, which could help the species survive in new environmental conditions. So it's really important that the species can produce sexually as well, exchanging genetic material and giving rise to new genes, which might help the species survive. That means that fragmented populations of any of these plants are a bad thing, and joined up areas of habitat that will allow that transfer of genes is a good thing. And then there's our snowbed, our specialist snowbed communities, communities of specialist lichens, mosses, and liverworts, which rely on long-lying snow cover to create their environmental niche, and they're already in decline. And we know that we can only expect that to continue. Thanks to the work of specialists working up here, people like Gordon Rotheroe of the British Biological Society, and research that's been led by Dave Genny at Nature Scott. We need this research to continue, and it's one of the things that we'll certainly be calling for, is that research to continue and the resources for that to allow that to happen. We vitally need to understand what's happening to these specialist species in these really, really niche environments. As the climate warms, the specialists are pushed out and the generalist species can move up the hill to take over. We lose the unique mountain zones that change with altitude, just like we do when we dump nitrogen pollution on the mountains, and just like we do when grazing levels become too high. Now, I promised this wouldn't be a doom and gloom talk. And I genuinely think that our mountains have got a chance. We need to know what's happening, and we need to know what's happening quickly across the mountains in Scotland. This summer, Plantlife teamed up with the James Hutton Institute to survey the summits of all the Munros, which are mountains over 3,000 feet above sea level in the Cairngorms National Park. There are 58 of those. Kaylee was responsible for leading this piece of work. We focused on what's beneath the surface in this study, carrying out an inventory of the hundreds of species of fungi which live unseen on the mountain summits. Now, luckily, we didn't have to identify them. We collaborated with hill walking groups, with Munro baggers, and people just keen to get out and about to do something for nature. These volunteers gathered soil samples, which were then analysed by the Hutton Institute back in the lab. And the results of this survey will tell us a huge amount about the diversity of species on the summits and how they're responding in response to nitrogen deposition, changes in the climate, and even things like grazing levels. It really is canary in the coal mine kind of stuff. We're hoping to report back on these surveys next spring in the next series of these Plantlife talks, so watch this space. Plantlife has also been training volunteers to carry out more traditional plant surveys in the mountains. When we know what's happening, we can try to come up with solutions that will help these environments, these ecosystems, become more resilient. The more people know, the more people care. And if society really values these ecosystems, then it will find a way to support landowners to look after them. Surely a great start would be helping those fragmented plant populations and those tiny scraps of mountain woodland down off their crags so they can spread across the hillside, forming resilient populations which will stand a much better chance in a changing climate. At the moment, they're so fragile, they're so beleaguered, they're so fragmented that it wouldn't take much to lose them completely. But we can do that. We can help them down off those crags. This is within our grasp. I think it's really interesting that one of the main impacts of climate change is a loss of specialist species and that homogenization of vegetation, because that's also one of the main impacts of nitrogen pollution. And as we've seen, it's also one of the main impacts of overgrazing. We've seen that plants can survive environmental changes if there is enough genetic diversity to allow them to adapt. And the only way they can do that is if there are big enough interlinked patches of habitat. I think that that gives us a little bit of hope. We might not be able to do a huge amount about the changing climate, but we can do something about the management of the land in the mountains to give these plants a fighting chance. In fact, I think surely we have to. When you lose the moss, you lose the dotterel. When you lose the Alpine Bistart, you lose the ptarmigan. When you lose the snowbeds, you lose the crane flies that live in the snowbed vegetation on which the dotterel and many other birds feed on. The more time you spend in the mountains, the more you realize that everything is connected. It's time to bump into another one of those Cairngorms legends. So I can't put it any better than Nan Shepherd put it in her book, The Living Mountain. All are aspects of one entity, the living mountain. Eagle and Alpine Veronica are part of the mountain's wholeness. Steloris and Azoides cannot live apart from the mountain, as well expect the eyelid to function if cut from the eye. I think, and Nan Shepherd is great on this, and I really recommend you to read The Living Mountain if you haven't already, that people are a part of the mountain as well, whether that's hill walkers, stalkers, pioneering botanists, ecologists, gamekeepers, farmers. You know, I grew up in the shadow of these mountains, and slowly over the years, I've grown to understand how complex they are. They're really at the sharp end, where land use, ecology, politics, culture, and climate change are all colliding, we're asking a huge amount from these mountains. And I would suggest we're asking a huge amount from the people who live there. We can take one mountain and we can describe it in so many different ways. These are just a few of the ways that people have described these mountains over the years. It's a wilderness to some people. To other people, it's a Munro. To some people, it's a U12 snowbed community, deer forest, estate, natural capital, blank canvas, home. We're all coming from such different starting points. It might be difficult to ever agree the best way to describe a mountain. But if we can group ourselves around a few descriptions that we can live with, if we can agree what we want to value, then we can make the mountains resilient, even in the face of massive changes to the climate. As I said at the start, I honestly don't know how much longer people will be able to go swimming in the Cairngorms in midsummer and look up at the snow. That loss might already be locked in, but there are things we can do. For a start, we can try to break down that barrier of disconnection between us and the mountains that started, I think, when people left the land and left their traditional farming systems. We can try to understand, really properly understand, what's happening to our mountain ecology. We can try to understand the different voices that describe the mountains and where those voices are coming from. We can appreciate and value the complexity and the diversity within all ecosystems, including our own. Let's finish up by bumping into old friends again. I'm going to finish up with another quote from Desmond Nethersill Thompson and Adam Watson in their book, The Cairngorms. The Cairngorms belong to all, but to no one group of people. Nothing is yet irretrievably lost, and future generations may yet applaud our foresight and courage. But the wonderful tops and plateaus are at greater risk than at any time since the last ice age. Time is short and fast running out. Thank you. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alistair. I've just been keeping an eye on the chat for us. We've not had any questions come through yet, but just a little reminder, if anyone has any questions, we can't see or hear you, so please do make use of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if there is anything you'd like to ask us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if anybody has anything, any questions, how long have we got? We've got 4 or 5 minutes left. If anybody does fancy asking a question, how would people get more involved, Kaylee? Have we got anything else coming up through the project, or are there other opportunities for people to kind of get involved in some of this stuff? And I know you and Gwenda maybe have a few plans for the mountains and the forests and the things that you're working on through the project.
Yeah, certainly. So we're just rounding up the project that Alistair's been speaking about in terms of sampling on the Munros, which is fantastic. We're hoping to do possibly something similar in the future. So if you'd be interested in, up the mountaintops, please do keep in touch with us. But what we've got coming up, there's a number of particularly rare species that we're looking to protect in the Cairngorms. So we're doing an awful lot of hands-on conservation, so getting out in those hills, in the woods, and doing what we can to protect those species. So some of those are twin flower and one-flowered wintergreen are some of the key species that we're working on at the moment. So next year we'll be looking at translocations and collecting cuttings of these plants. So if that's something you'd be interested in, do get in touch. I'll pop some extra links in the chat feed. Also, there's the National plant monitoring scheme as well, which is fantastic. And that's you know, not specific to our project work, but they do have quadrats across the Cairngorms that are looking to be sampled, and at the moment we've not got any not sampled, looking to be monitored, and at the moment we've not got anyone signed up to those. So it'd be a fantastic help in terms of finding out more about what's on those mountaintops. If you are nearby and it's a place you can access, it's a great way to get involved. So I'll pop the NPMS link here for you if you are interested in looking at any squares the National Plant Monitoring Scheme has. We have had a few questions come through. I'm not sure if you can see these, Alistair. Would you like me to read them out?
Go for it.
Faye has asked, are there any interventions such as creating exclosures to keep out deer and stabilise communities being trialled?
That's a good question. So there have in the past been sort of experimental exclosures done to try to keep deer out. It's quite an artificial way of protecting the habitat. Deer fences tend to be very expensive. At these kind of altitudes, deer fences don't really get on very well. They get really battered by the conditions. And amazingly, although a deer fence is a tall structure, the snow, even still, today, the drifts of snow can sometimes be so high, and are quite often so high in the winter, that the deer fences just get completely covered and the deer just wander over. So exclosures aren't generally the best way of reducing the population. It really has to be a kind of a much more widespread across huge landscape areas kind of approach of sustainably managing the deer numbers down. That tends to be much more effective in the long term. It also is worth remembering that the plant communities that we're talking about here have evolved and in fact need some grazing. So excluding grazing completely could also be as damaging as having overgrazing. It's all about having deer numbers at the correct kind of levels that these plants would have evolved to be able to cope with.
Okay, brilliant. And oh, we've got lots coming through now, which is great. Do we work on the Scots pine forests near Rothiemurchus? So it's definitely an area that we're working in. So definitely kind of Badenoch and Strathspey area where we're definitely working in there and doing woodland management and whatnot. I don't know if you want to add any more to that, Alistair.
And that's as you say, Kaylee, that's a big part of what you and Gwenda are working on. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. What different emphasis do you put on habitat conservation compared to reintroductions and population manipulation? That's from Barbara.
It's a good question. I think yeah, they definitely have to go hand in hand, and we would always want to start with habitat conservation and addressing the cause of any losses. So reintroductions can work, or boosting populations can work when species have become so fragmented from each other that they can't reproduce. But that can only work when you're addressing the cause that has led to them becoming so reduced in population in the first place. So I think it has to be a combination of habitat conservation and reintroductions, or almost kind of reinforcement. If you're confident that you're changing those conditions to allow those species to thrive in the future. So it's that's a good kind of ongoing question which conservationists, ecologists, land managers are kind of grappling with at the moment in the Cairngorms and further afield.
Lovely, and I think we've got one more. So how are you as the Plantlife community broadening nature experiences to other groups of people to include varied urban populations, cultures, ethnicities, racial groups, etc.? other people that may otherwise be left out from that nature experience?
That's another good question. And Kaylee, I'll let you sort of come in from a project perspective on that. But I suppose, you know, there's a range of things that we're doing. I'm partly, hopefully, kind of doing things like this starts to increase the scope of the audience, the number of people that we can talk to, and hopefully almost creating a very kind of accessible entry point into something which can seem quite unfamiliar, quite remote, and quite complicated in some cases. So it's something that we're constantly thinking about and trying to develop in Plantlife at that level, at the level of our communications. But there's also work going on within the project itself. And when we were putting this project together, we thought quite a bit about how we would try to do just that, to broaden out the scope. There's been things like the leaflets, working with mountain guides, walk leaders, health walk leaders, maybe kind of training people who are working with these audiences so they feel a bit more confident at talking about some of these things to try and help us to take steps into those new communities. Kaylee, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, definitely. So as well, particularly young people, we'd like to get more involved with getting out and about and taking their first steps into conservation and learning more about nature. So we're trying to target different activities, particularly to young people, but very much the work that we're doing, the hands-on conservation work that we're doing in the Cairngorms, we try to reach out to communities, be that locally in the area or a little bit further afield that are within, traveling distance, and land managers, landowners that might not consider that conservation aspect, getting them involved as well, and visitors too. So even people passing through, we're trying to create materials that can just help educate and spread that knowledge to anyone coming through, even if it's just for a day trip and having a walk around one of the estates, through our leaflets and whatnot.
Brilliant.
Great. So there's one more question here. I'll just check that's not one come through on the chat feed, but the last question we've gotten here is, are the issues in loss of species and habitat similar in the Western Highlands?
There are lots of similarities. There are lots of things, particularly around grazing levels, climate change and nitrogen pollution, which are the same in the Western Highlands as well. There are some local differences, and there are some species that you'll only get in the West Highlands that you don't get in the Cairngorms, and vice versa. But yeah, a lot of the issues that we have been talking about today, that we've been talking about this afternoon, are common across the Central Highlands and the West Highlands, even if the species, some of the more specialist species maybe, are slightly different. Okay,
Great.
is that?
I think that's all our questions for now.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Kaylee, for keeping us on track. Thank you for everything you're doing on the Cairngorms project as well. That's fantastic, a really amazing project, and I definitely recommend everyone to check out the Plantlife webpage about the project. It's pretty amazing what Kaylee and Gwenda are doing in the Cairngorms at the moment. So thank you everyone. Fall into Nature, this series of events, is happening throughout the rest of October, and there's lots of really good talks coming up, so definitely check out the website and book yourself onto some more talks. We'd love for you to stay in touch with us as well, stay in touch with Plantlife. You can see how to do that on these, I'm trying to work out which way to point, social media platforms. So do stay in touch and support Plantlife, and yeah, just continue to be part of the conversation. It's been great to have a wander through the Cairngorms this lunchtime with you all. Hopefully see you all soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.